Good morning. Welcome to the webinar on demystifying design. We are from Cantina, based in Boston. I'm joined by my colleague Chris Lamont. A little bit about Cantina. We're a digital design and development agency based in Boston since 2007. We're in the Seaport area, and we focus on the design and development of digital products for our customers. My name is Alex Francisconi. I'm currently the president of Cantina, and joining me today is...
I am Chris Lamont, currently Director of Experience Design at Cantina. And prior to this, I was at both Harvard Business School, leading the design and development of e-learning projects. And then before that at Isovar, formerly known as Molecular. There's a nice photo of me as well, just to show you, what I look like. I've dropped some weight and I've got a haircut, but that was the best photo I could find, so I apologize. So, why is there so much mystification? That's a great question. So, and what is it about design that has non-designers scratching their heads? What is it that brings you all here today? And I suspect some of the reason for that is the FUD that stems from the historical concept of design, which has then had an impact on folks their understanding of the process of design. So my goal today is to bring some demystification to the design process, to really just shed some light on how we approach design at Cantina and how we've gotten past the notion of mystification with our clients. It's worth noting that this is not a new concept, and that industry leaders have been taking different stabs at bringing clarity to design and design process for quite some time. But I think that as the market matures and new means of digital distribution continue to proliferate, we have the Internet of Things, we have mobile devices, and there seems to be no stopping that flow or that tide. There continues to be more and more mystery around how do you solve design problems for those vehicles. And I think on top of that, there's Mad Men, there's Steve Jobs, there's Johnny Ive, there's these cults of personality that really contribute to the notion that design is mysterious and full of mystique. So what is design? That's a big question. We're probably not going to solve that or answer that question in this webinar. But what I do want to talk about is why is it such a loaded concept, and how can we unload that concept? So the first thing I'm going to do is just lowercase design to bring even the concept into a more approachable and friendly realm. So what is design? Is design art? So historically, this has been what folks think they think of when they think of art. Of design. It's really the de facto synonym for design, and it puts it in the field of masters like Da Vinci, and in this case, literally out of people's hands. And almost deified, right? It's like it's up in the sky, it's untouchable, it's near God. So, historically, there's a lot of baggage that comes along with this idea of art as design. Or is the fact that design is immeasurable, like this concept of it's vast, it's unknowable, how could we possibly fathom and therefore understand design? Some folks, it's magic, and they really appreciate the illusion. They know that that there's an answer behind the curtains, but they're more interested in the allure and the fantasy of design, and less interested in understanding how someone achieves the trick. And then, frankly, there's a large contingent of folks who think it's purely lipstick. It's merely a veneer that's layered atop function at some point in a process. To really get to a final deliverable. But the good news here is that I'm actually seeing this less and less, and so I do have to give a nod of thanks to Steve Jobs for really proving that design is a valuable aspect of our products. So those are some of the contributing factors that lead into this notion of design as a big scary thing that only other people do. But let's shift gears a little bit now and talk about the design process, and more specifically the design process that has been informing and impacting digital products and services for the last 20 years. So to do that, we have to step into the Wayback Machine, get into a time machine, and go back to 1998. Remember, Bill Clinton's getting impeached, Saving Private Ryan, Titanic. These These are movies in the theaters. The iMac is just hitting the shelves. And Google is really a fledgling search engine battling it out with folks like Hotbot and Ask Jeeves. This is also the year that I got into the business. And it wasn't long after that I was exposed to what is really the traditional software development lifecycle. Now, in full disclosure, for the purposes of today's discussion, I'm going to focus solely on the design-related aspects of that process, and I'm going to overgeneralize and oversimplify for the sake of expedience. But in a nutshell, the process was heavy on analysis. We spent a lot of time, months and months, interviewing stakeholders and product managers, capturing in great detail every conceivable requirement you could imagine. And our primary deliverable at this phase, this assessment phase, was a beautifully bound requirements document. Really compelling reads. You know, Alec and I must have we've made hundreds of these beautifully leather-bound requirements documents that were really, they were large, they were unwieldy, and they were frankly hard to, you know, derive a design from. So what did we do? We did all the stakeholder interviews. We captured the requirements in a documented form, and then there was this. Okay, we throw it up over the wall to the design team, and then the design team would, you know, work some of this magic on these requirements and come up with. At the time, the first thing what we did very frequently was we would come back to the client in this sort of you know, again, mysterious, grandiose, theatrical way, and we would do this big reveal of, okay, here's your design. We found that we positioned ourselves as if we thought of ourselves, frankly, as, you know, analogous to Don Draper, right? Like, we're going to turn a photo wheel into a carousel, and in this meeting, you know, we're going to convince you of the merits of all of this magical work that we did while drinking whiskey, you know, drinking martinis at lunch. And then from your perspective, or from a client perspective, it was often, oh boy, you know, let's make a deal. Here's 3 choices, and I don't really understand a lot of the work that went into these 3 choices, and I'm basically I like aspects of 1 and 3, and maybe the footer from number 2. So then we got into this Frankenstein design approach, and really there were no winners in this approach at all. So fast forward a little bit to, you know, the UX design process. Now we've changed from the web design process to the UX design process. It's matured. We're starting to think about, you know, holistically the user experience rather than just like creating, you know, designing effective web pages. And so for the next decade, frankly, we have some slight changes. We do the analysis phase again, but we've introduced personas. And personas, frankly, the notion of personas was, you know, the dynamic at the time was we had clients and we had consultants, and it was a lot of opinion. And the goal of the persona initially was to create sort of a neutral third party that was actually representative of the user of the product or service. So it was a lofty goal, and they took a lot of work to get them right. And if you didn't get them right, it was frankly a waste of time. But so good or bad, we had personas. But then we threw that over the wall, and then back came a wireframe. So the wireframe was the next deliverable here, and the wireframe, this was, you know, the designer's attempt to say, okay, let's not concentrate on the look and feel and the colors, but let's talk about the functionality and the more about less about the high gloss form, but more about the functionality and the overall layout of a solution. So we were able to start to divorce the final look and feel from the functionality. So then we created all these things, and then we plugged them into our formula, and then we throw it back over the wall to the visual designers, who would come back and we do another unveiling of the latest and greatest version of your product. And then later, if we're lucky, we'd have the ability to do some user testing. But typically, this was done way late in the process, after a relatively substantial development period. So we were testing a final product before it went to market, but we didn't really have a lot of time to change course or to fix any large issues, and it was expensive, frankly. So we realized that, gosh, there must be a better way to do this. So we're looking at, what are the problems with the process? Well, our user expectations are continually missed because are we asking users? The only time in that process that we're really talking to users is frankly at the end when we're testing, our assumptions and our solutions with them. So that meant, we had really long development cycles because we were wasting time on building the wrong solutions, and then frankly QAing them and fixing those things. There was an enormous amount of time wasted in assessment meetings where folks would just sit around and with the best of intentions, but really trying to think about every possible angle and capturing every possible requirement of this solution. And then it also came down to it was difficult to justify decisions and directions at that point. It was it really came down to it wasn't evidence-based or data-based. Data-based. It was it was just the opinions in the room. So how can we do this in a better way? So there's long been a cliche that design is some blend of art and science. Well, that's great, but really, what's the blend? Does it trend toward one or the other? And when you plot these on a spectrum, so on the one end you have art, which is highly qualitative. On the other end you have science, which is obviously quantitative. But these are two opposite extremes. Now, Tian and Lax had a presentation where they talked about comparing and contrasting art versus science, and so the method to arrive at a piece of art is typically intuition, and it's validated by beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? So that's really challenging in a business setting to make a case for that type of process. On the other end, on the scientific end, the method is investigation, and it's validated by metrics. So you can actually test these things and say, did we see a lift in our KPI? So I've also heard this notion that design is where science and art break even. So if we chart design now, that means design is supposed to land, basically right in the middle. But that doesn't really help us much, when we're defining a process to say that it's right in the middle between art and science. What I like to think about is, and Diane Lieber, who's a designer somewhere in the world, came up with this notion of design is art with objectives. And she goes on to say that art does not need to set goals to be art. It's okay with experimentation. Whereas design favors set goals and restraints. And more importantly, it resides in the realm of the measurable. That's really helpful. So if we think about design as residing in the realm of the measurable, that means it tips the scales towards science. And if we tip the scales towards science, this becomes a much more comfortable and quantifiable area for us to design within. And the direct effect is that this transformation frees decision-making to be based on evidence and on data rather than on opinion. So since we're in the realm of science, I'd say 4 years ago here at Cantina, we decided to say, I alluded to earlier, there must be a better way. So how can we refine our design process? So let's go to the tried and true. The scientific method has been proven for years and years and years. So how does the scientific method translate to the design process? Well, here is the scientific method, right? This is for a lot of folks. I'm sure you can harken back to high school days or even middle school days, where essentially you're defining a question, you're gathering information, you form a hypothesis, you test your hypothesis, you interpret the data, and then that you either go back to the start or you've proven your hypothesis. That's kind of in a nutshell. We're going to, for the purposes of today's discussion, I want to focus on these four key aspects of the scientific method, which is again defining the question, forming a hypothesis, testing, and interpretation. Interestingly, this is around the same time that the lean methodology was gaining some traction, and there's a lot of parallels to the lean methodology, the idea of build, measure, learn, which the cycle of quick releases and quick prototyping. So at the same time that this nascent lean thinking was percolating, we were also aware of those changes. So defining a question or an assumption, right? This is really getting to what is the business goals, and what is the impact of not meeting those business goals? What specific KPIs can we track in order to know that we've achieved our goal? And what's really important here is really getting to team consensus, right? It's consensus and agreement on the problem statement and the goals, and frankly, the success criteria. Without that, you know, you're starting off on a bad foundation of solving a problem. So the next thing we want to talk about is just a hypothesis statement. And these are real simple. Hypothesis comes down to basically if this, then that. In the form of, you know, in a lean or in a scientific method, you know, Jeff Gotthelf, who wrote the Lean UX book, came up with this definition of a hypothesis. And the key components here: what is the solution that we propose? Who's it for? What are we hoping it will achieve? And how will we know we're on the right path? And that's the critical one, is what's the yardstick that we're using to assure that we're going down the right path? So then you need to test your hypothesis. So once you've defined the hypothesis, there are any number of tools and techniques in the designer's tool belt that can get us to validating a hypothesis. So there's card sorting, there's tree testing. These are techniques that are used more on you know, content-heavy type of sites where there's a lot of IA work to be done. Wireframes, I'm sure you've seen these at some point if you've ever been involved in a digital design product. This is, again, what I talked about earlier. It's, you know, what does the layout start to look like without all of without the lipstick on it, frankly. There are style tiles. These are kind of akin to a mood board. It's essentially, you know, the idea of, you know, how can we, at an atomic level, start to define the look and feel of how, you know, our site or product might come together. And then there's prototypes, and the prototypes span a range of fidelity. So this is, for example, a very low fidelity prototype that we would use to test the hypothesis. Or on the other end, there's lots of you know, the web-based tools, or, you know, you can write HTML from scratch to get to a really high fidelity prototype. And it really all depends on what it is that you're looking to test, and that's how you would select, you know, the methodology and the testing techniques that you would use.
Yeah, I think right here, Chris, if I could step in, I think it's really critical to understand that aspect of this process, and I think that's really where, in my experience and the experience Chris and I have had over the years, this has changed a lot. First of all, this is certainly not meant to be the full gamut of different ways you can test a hypothesis, but it's a good overview. But the real important thing to understand is, what are you trying to test? And that should help you to understand what kind of output that you need to be testing with the user. So to Chris's point, a low fidelity type of prototype or wireframe even might be really useful to just validate the feasibility of something. You're not cluttering any of that image with any of the visual aspects of it, color, typography, anything like that. Whereas once you get to a much more fully formed user interface, you might be testing the true usability of it as it's closer to its realization and what you want to release to market. That is a really critical point here in this process.
Yeah, and one other thing is frankly, everything is testable. And so as long as you understand that the fidelity of your results will match the fidelity of your test, meaning, you know, kind of alluding to what Alex was just saying, you understand and that the value you get out of it is tied to the value that or the effort that you put into it, or not the effort, but. So the final step then is interpreting the data, drawing conclusions. Now, there are no images to support what this looks like. I mean, this is, you know, this is a bunch of people looking at data, and this is a team of designers and product managers and stakeholders, you know, really understanding, okay, we understand what our hypothesis was, these are our test results, how do we move forward? So that cycle can continue to iterate, and so let's talk, you know, back to brass tacks. How has this impacted our design process? So this is today's design process, subject to change, but here's where we are starting, you know, about 2010 and today. So here's where we were in 2010. Remember, it was inputs, personas, over the wall. We've got some wireframes. Then we did some visual design. Then we threw it back over the wall. Then we did Monty Hall, and then we did some user testing. Well, we've managed to eliminate a whole bunch of these steps which is good. That's, nobody wants to spend effort on something that's not valuable. And what are we left with? We're left with, we still have to do stakeholder interviews and analysis. It's critical for us to understand business goals and business processes. More importantly, we want to put users into this process up front and start talking to them right away. And that's really critical. And what we need to do here is make sure that we're actually talking to users and we don't have proxies or stand-ins for users. We want to go to them directly and have a conversation so we don't have the telephone game, or we don't have, lost in translation, or we don't get generalizations. We want real facts.
Yeah, one point of clarification here, just if we're kind of going through the last two slides. We X'd out personas in the previous slide. That's not to indicate that personas don't have a value in the process. I think to allude to Chris's point earlier in our experience, personas are excellent tools at segmenting an audience, and I know a lot of companies, including some folks who are likely on the line today, have personas as part of their marketing toolkit. It makes sense. You need to be able to segment your audience and understand them. I think our point is use the personas if you have them to understand who the users are that we need to talk to in this process. You can't use the persona as a proxy for that conversation. You just use a persona as a way to understand who in that audience we need to prioritize and talk to as part of this process.
We've also, you might notice, we've eliminated all of the throwing over the wall, which means there's a lot more collaboration, and that's, again, everyone on the project team. And also there's no more big reveals. And we'll talk a little bit more about, the detriment of the big reveal in a moment. But essentially this process, this cyclical process of analyzing, hypothesizing, speaking to users, creating a prototype, testing it with users, and then coming back to the group to analyze the data. That's fundamentally the new design approach that we evangelize here at Cantina. So one might ask, how do we know when we're done? And the answer is, frankly, you're never done. As I mentioned earlier, with the proliferation of IoT devices on the horizon, or it's frankly here, the days of sort of ship it and forget it are over. The dynamic change, users' needs change, things continue to change, user expectations change. So for a moment in time, you might have tapped into a reasonably good approximation of a solution, but until you go out and test your solution and then learn something and then refine and continue continuous improvement, that's what the market demands, that's what users demand, and that's why if you embark upon a digital project or a digital entity, it's going to take care and feeding in the long term. Okay, so some considerations that I would just think are key for folks to take away. There's only one deliverable, and really the goal here is that every single work product that we create during the process is only a means to an end. So with that in mind, we want to expend just enough effort and really no more to get as much value out of that artifact as possible. Glossy presentations are great for executive stakeholders, and we still frankly have to do them on occasion. But if we don't have to do them, that's more time that we can spend on prototyping and testing. So really focus on the end goal, which is your one deliverable. Another key consideration is this really is sausage making, and it's not always pretty. So that means don't expect to be blown away by the polish and the luster or the divine inspiration of the people that are in the room. There is going to be frustration. There will be dead ends. You will end up with more questions, heated discussion, diverging interpretations, and all of that stuff. That's the messy part of collaboration, but it's really critical. So speaking of collaboration, it takes two at least to tango, right? So collaboration is a buzzword. You hear it all the time, but frankly, it requires participation. So if we don't want to throw things over the wall, this means, for us, this often means we're co-locating, we're creating war rooms. We're identifying a dedicated client teammate who is empowered to make decisions, and that person is working with us, not necessarily full-time, but in a much more active role. It's not we're going to come over once a week and show you, where we've gotten. We want to talk with real people. It's far, far easier, it's cheaper, and way more valuable to get real insight from real human beings than to ask questions of some amalgamated fiction. So it's, well, to Alex's point, while it's important to be able to segment your audience using personas, it's actually more critical in the design phase to talk to actual people to get feedback. And so how many people do you need to talk to? We found that, depending on the level of complexity and the comfort of clients and stakeholders, 5 is really enough. After that, it's kind of diminishing returns. You start to hear the same things over and over again. So you can certainly scale up to 10, 15, but again, there's an investment of time and effort involved in that. So we found that 5 is enough. And so when you think about that, user testing is really cheap. Like, an hour session sitting down with someone, that's 5 hours per iteration. That's not a lot of time, and it saves you a lot of downstream revision. So I just wanted to reference, IBM released a user-centered design report back in 2013 where they found, and I'll quote, "For developers and manufacturers, the advantages of creating usable products far outweigh the cost. The rule of thumb, every dollar invested in ease of use returns 10 to 100. So clearly there's an ROI here. Another consideration, always be testing. Validation helps to steer the ship in the right direction at a very micro level. So rather than waiting for the iceberg to appear on the horizon, if you continue to tack in the right direction based on evidence, you'll be far better off, in the long term. Remember, there's no crystal balls here, so incremental proof, far more effective and efficient, and frankly less risky than some massive public unveiling.
Also, obviously, in today's technology world, it's a lot easier to Chris's point, frankly, less expensive than it used to be to do this type of testing. I mean, it's easier to do A/B testing when you have something that's actually went to production. It's easier to do just user testing on an interface, and don't be afraid to test very specific portions of that. If you focus on a very specific area of the interface or perhaps another hypothesis within that flow that you want to test, that's a better strategy than just saying, we're just going to test the interface and see how it does at a very macro level. It's just too unfocused. So kind of the same discipline should apply.
Yep. So forgo the big reveal. It's really it's just bad juju all around. I don't think I've ever, frankly, been in a situation where we presented we revealed a design and everybody loved it without any changes. It just doesn't happen. And so what ends up happening there is there's this momentum that's lost. The client has these big expectations and they end up disappointed. The designers end up hurt and frustrated because their work wasn't regaled and rejoiced. And customers, your users, frankly, often reject change. So if you just drop a big change on them, there's precedent to show that you lose users that way. So it's better to do the incremental, transparent design process than it is to rely on some big production. And last but not least, this idea of lean or agile or scientific method does not alleviate the need to have rigor around your process. So just as scientists must adhere to procedures and process, by our virtue of co-opting their process, we actually need the same level of rigor. You have to have your process defined, you have to have your objectives defined, and you need to be tracking your data with a level of intent to ensure that your results are clean and true.
I think that the objectives part is really critical. I think we've all been involved with projects, and this happens a lot with bigger website redesigns where the objective that you actually are told when you first are maybe embarking on the project or introduced to the project is, well, we just want a new look and feel. And that by itself is not sufficient to do this type of work. And it's just too vague, it's too uncentered, and it's too subjective or based on one or several people's opinion. And that's not to say, hey, we need to update the site to reflect the new branding direction we're going. Okay, fine, that's a very valid objective. But in our process and in our recommendation, we would look at that and say, great, but how do we decompose that into more specific assumptions or hypotheses that we can test about that brand and about that look and feel in that direction, so that we're bringing it back to a KPI and a specific, ideally set of metrics that might drive the business beyond just look and feel or changing the direction because the brand is changing direction.
Okay. So those are our considerations. That's our demystification of design. I'd like to just throw it out to folks if you have any questions.
Okay, we have a question from the audience. How do you estimate the work and give guidance to customers? That's a great question. Estimating this work is not easy. I mean, I'll be honest with you, and we've done this for years. Again, to Chris's point, there isn't really a crystal ball. So just like you don't necessarily know the direction when you start of where the design's going to end up or all the ramifications of that with your users, it's sometimes hard to do that from an estimation perspective. But we do have to give estimates, we do have to create expectations and give guidance to customers. So let me take a step back a little bit. Typically these processes, when we run them, and I think this is something that's fairly industry standard at this point, we think of these in sprints. So obviously we alluded to the idea that there's a lean UX kind of methodology that's underpinning a lot of the way we think about these things. And within that also just speaks to how the Agile framework and methodology plays into it. So we typically approach a larger design effort and break it into smaller pieces, and we break it into these sprints. And these sprints typically are 2 weeks long. The reason why they're 2 weeks long is because that gives us, the team, enough time to do the work that they need to do in, say, that first week to get a prototype or some asset ready to test, and then get a test plan together, get users in at the end of the first week or early in the second week, and then be able to recover and analyze that data to set up the next sprint. So 2 weeks is about the right time. Could you do it in 1 week? Sure, and there are people who do it, but you really have to be coordinated. You really have to have your process down. Everybody has to kind of be really singing from the same sheet of music, which is not to say it can't happen in the 2 week sprint, but we like to use 2 weeks because it gives enough time for us to be able to handle any kind of curveballs that might come up as part of the process. So with that said, we usually think of these in 2 week increments, and then we actually really will kind of box the overall number of sprints based on the level of complexity, and I know that's pretty vague, so let me break it down a little bit. There's a couple different, let's use some real examples. If you're building a 401k app and you're building a product that's going to require basically a set of users to go through the process of signing up for a 401k and essentially completing that entire process within that app, ideally without any interference or any help from the organization itself, well, we all know that's not a simple process necessarily. There's a lot of steps that go into that, from your basic information about who you are, through to who the beneficiaries are, how you're going to allocate your funds, what are your goals, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of pieces to it, and it's a very serious thing to do. That's a fairly complex flow, and there's a lot of hypotheses that start to stem off of that if you think about it. Well, if we're being approached to do that, we'll probably look at that and say, think about, at least at a high level, what are the key flows we have to address here? What are maybe some of the hypotheses, and then we start to scale the number of sprints based on that. You might contrast that with an app online that's very simple. Maybe it's a mobile app. It's a very simple screen, a couple screens. You're swiping back and forth to make decisions. There isn't really a lot of user input required except some basic interfaces. That may require less time. It may not, though, because the reason is you like to think about what you're trying to get out from an objective perspective, how much complexity you're hiding behind the scenes, and what are you addressing with the user that might cause them to stumble in the process. But I think you get the idea that you kind of look at the complexity and really what you're doing with this app, what's happening behind the scenes, and what the users are expected to do, and we use that as a way to scale the number of sprints in a kind of a time box fashion.
Yeah. Also important to note that the simplicity of the design or the UI belies the complexity of the effort it took to get there.
Right.
So when you think about something like, Uber is really simple, right? I just walk outside and I flip it open and it knows my location and I can request a car. It's a very simple flow for the user, but there's a lot of stuff happening in the background. So you can't it's not like you can use the simplicity of the user experience to measure the effort that goes into the project itself.
Yeah, it's really the flow of what you expect the user to go through. That's part of it, or the flow of what's required of that user. And even there's another example. I mean, even Google recently just changed their logo, which a lot of folks have noticed. They did a tremendous amount of testing on that. It took them a long time to just change the logo. So again, it seems simple, but you do have to really peek under the covers and think about what you're doing there.
Yeah, did they have an estimate of like how much testing they did and how long it took them?
I think I heard something somewhere. It was a lot of testing. They weren't listening to our 5 rule. I can tell you that.
Yeah.
But you know, at the same time, I also need that to come back to the 5 rule. That typically is 5 per segment too. If you have 4 or 5 different audience segments, you might need to do 5 per segment. And I think if you think about Google, because they cover so much ground in terms of who uses it, they actually did a lot of testing primarily because they have such a wide demographic of people who use that site. They really wanted to cover as many of those bases.
So internationalized.
Internationalized, yeah. There's a lot of actual cross currents there. Okay, our next question is, so how do I choose the right firm to do this, assuming I'm going to go out to the market to choose the firm? Great question, something that's near and dear to our heart, of course. I would say, from my perspective, and just having you know, we have a lot of experience in this realm, I would tell you what not to do first. I don't think it makes sense, and we see this happen actually time and again. If you look for a firm that has tried to solve or has solved the exact same problem that you think you have for a competitor, and that's the reason why you hire them, and that's the sole reason, that's dangerous. That actually might not lead to the success you want. It might, but looking at a very narrow domain expertise as your entree or your main factor in choosing a firm actually might lead you down the wrong path. Other things to consider, and I'm not saying experience doesn't count, but other things to consider is the culture of the firm, and underlying that really, more importantly, is the process. Because what we're talking about here is process. Design is a process, as we've just talked about for the last half hour. Understanding that process and feeling comfortable in what that firm is going to do with you, not to you, but with you as part of that process is really, really important. And also diversity of work, actually, we find is very important. In our own experience, it does. We cover a lot of ground here at Cantina. We don't just do financial services apps or just do mobile or just do a technology. You know, we're really generalists. We cover a number of different verticals and a number of different technologies, and therefore we see a lot of different problems. And we're adept at flexing ourselves to those problems and trying to come up with the best solution, again, based on a solid process that's grounded in research, that's grounded in understanding business goals and user goals. So really looking for those pieces, the culture, the process, and that diversity of work that shows that they can solve a variety of problems is actually a great way to think about how to hire a firm if you're asking them to do design, because they will come at the problem, probably they'll come at it with a whole variety of different solutions, including some that maybe you didn't think of, but actually are really impactful for your business and your end solution.
Yeah. So, and I would just add to echo the notion of culture and process. You know, the process, for example, that we just outlined. If you don't think that's going to work for your organization, if you're you know, you have a much more strict set of requirements and you have a process that's much more rigid. It doesn't mean that our process can't work within there, but it does immediately impose some challenges. So you have to ask yourself, like, does the process that I'm buying into, does that mesh well with the organization or can it mesh well with the organization that I'm a part of?
Right.
And then you know, the other half of that coin are the people that are going to be in the room with me. Are those people I can work with? You know, it comes down to, is there a personality fit? Is there a culture fit? Do I like these people? Because you're going to be spending a lot of time in collaborative sessions with these people, so you might as well get along really well, or at least be friendly.
Great. Looking at the list, I don't think we have any other questions from the audience. So with that, I guess we're going to wrap up today's session. I hope it's been informative and enjoyable for you, and I believe we'll be at least making these slides available, most likely through SlideShare or some other type of venue, and we'll keep the attendees posted on where that's at. Thank you very much.